All right, well, the first edition of the 2022 College Football Playoff Rankings came out last night around 7 o'clock on ESPN. And of course, all of our favorite things to do, right? Bitch, moan, and complain about rankings and polls. You have kind of two opposing arguments when it comes to rankings and polls in general this time of year. The first one is they don't matter. No, it doesn't matter. Who cares where anyone is ranked right now? It has nothing to do with anything. The only thing that matters is the final college football ranking that comes out the Saturday after Conference Championship Day, and every other poll and every other ranking, including the first 4 or 5 playoff rankings that come out leading up to that final ranking, are garbage and don't mean anything at all. That's one kind of argument. Then you have the other side who, looks at these rankings like they're scripture. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Generally speaking, yes, the rankings don't technically matter until the final playoff ranking the day after Conference Championship Saturday, because that's the ranking, the final college football playoff ranking, which comes out the Sunday after Conference Championship Saturday in December. That's what's used to determine playoff rankings and bowl games. So technically, those people are right. These rankings and polls and ratings and all that stuff don't technically matter. However, I think in specific instances and circumstances or situations, they can matter, particularly with the playoff ranking. For example, if you're currently ranked in this first playoff ranking somewhere like 11 through 20, it's going to be much harder for you to move up into the top 4, right, than if you're currently already ranked 1 through 10. If you're ranked 6 or 7 right now, you really only need a couple of teams ahead of you to lose, and then you need to win, and chances are you'll have a good shot at getting in, right? If you're ranked 14, 15, or 16, you need a lot of teams to lose ahead of you. You have to really impress the committee over the next month, not to mention win all your games. So while technically I agree that these rankings aren't used to determine anything, those are the final rankings, where you're ranked right now can either help or hinder you in your ability to move up to the top 4 in a short period of time. About 4 weeks is all you have, right? And so then you have to look at your remaining schedule. If you're ranked 12th or 13th right now, or 14th or 18th or something like that, and you don't have any games remaining against what the playoff committee considers to be a highly ranked team, how can you possibly impress the playoff committee, right? On the other hand, if you're a team that's ranked 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that, and you have a chance of winning your division, you're going to get probably a highly ranked matchup in your conference championship game, which would give you one last opportunity to impress the committee and potentially move up before that last ranking. You may even have regular season games left on your schedule. The Georgia-Tennessee matchup this coming weekend and the Ohio State-Michigan matchup coming up the last week of the regular season are 2 great examples of that, right? Whoever wins the Georgia-Tennessee game, obviously that's going to be very impressive to the committee because the committee has both of those teams ranked very high. Same thing with the Ohio State and Michigan game at the end of the year. On the other hand, if you're Georgia or Tennessee and you lose this weekend, look at your remaining schedule. There's not really an opportunity for the loser of the Georgia-Tennessee game this weekend to play any more games during the regular season that the playoff committee is going to consider impressive. Tennessee's got Missouri, South Carolina, and Vandy. None of those teams are ranked in the playoff committee's top 25, so beating those teams wouldn't really do that much to impress the committee. If you're Georgia, who do you have left? Kentucky, Mississippi State, and Georgia Tech. Same thing. Those aren't considered to be very good teams. So even if Georgia and Tennessee were to win their remaining 3 games after this weekend, 45-0, it's going to be the whole, well, who had they played deal, right? You know what I mean? So it makes these games big and important based on where you're ranked now. Tennessee, for example, is ranked 1 in the playoff rankings, right? If they lose to Georgia, how far really will they fall? Because Georgia's, 3rd in the playoff rankings? Tennessee loses by 3 to Georgia this weekend. How far do they fall? 4? 5? 6? I mean, what you tell me? I'm asking. I'm asking you what you think. So it in that respect, it does matter where you're ranked now, right? Let's say for whatever reason, Tennessee happened to be ranked 6th in this ranking that just came out. They're not. They're ranked 1. But just as an example, if Tennessee was ranked 1st or 6th in this ranking, and then let's say they lose to Georgia by 14, where do they fall? They fall to 10, 12, whatever. You see what I mean? So it does matter that Tennessee is ranked 1, Georgia is ranked 3. The higher you are ranked now, potentially now, no guarantees, but potentially the better off you are to absorb a loss in the last 3-4 weeks of the season. So neither argument is really true. The whole "it doesn't matter at all" argument, that's not really true. And the people who set alarms and their whole life revolves around this current set of rankings, that's not really accurate either. Truth, like usual, falls somewhere in the middle. Now, before I get to nitpicking the playoff rankings, everybody's got some problems with it, right? When I look at rankings, to me, rankings for specific teams fall into one of three categories. I see where a team is ranked and I say, you know what? I agree with that. That's exactly where I would have them ranked. Good job. Or I look at the ranking and I go, I wouldn't have that team there, but I can understand why somebody would rank them there. Maybe somebody's ranked fifth and I look at it and I go, I don't know. I probably would have them sixth or seventh, or I probably would have them third or fourth. You have them fifth. I disagree, but I understand why you have them fifth. I get it. The argument makes sense to me why you would have them there. So even though I disagree, it's not a big deal to me. I get it. I understand it. And then there's a third sort of landing spot where sometimes I look at a team and where they're ranked and I just, I shake my head and scratch my head and I go, I don't understand how any rational, reasonable human being has watched college football this year and has that team ranked there. They should be way higher, or they should be way lower, or whatever. So when I look at a team and where they're ranked, usually falls into one of those three spots. Before I go through and nitpick the playoff rankings, here's my top 10. I released this I live streamed the playoff rankings show last night. It came on at 7. I started streaming about 6:30, I think, or 6:45. And before the playoff rankings came out, I put my top 10 on the screen. My top 10, if I had a vote in the playoff rankings, would have been as follows. Tennessee 1, Georgia 2, Michigan 3, Ohio State 4, TCU 5, Clemson 6. Those are your undefeated teams. I had them 1 through 6. I had Bama at 7, the highest rated one-loss team. I then had Oregon at 8. I had UCLA at 9 and Southern Cal at 10. So top 6, all undefeated, 7, 8, 9, 10, one loss each. Southern Cal has a loss to Utah. Oregon has a loss to Georgia. Bama has a loss to Tennessee. And UCLA has a loss to Southern Cal's a loss to Utah. UCLA lost to Oregon. Oregon lost to Georgia. Bama lost to top 10. So decent losses for all of those one-loss teams. That would have been my vote for the playoff top 10. Now that doesn't mean I think the playoff committee got it totally wrong. A lot of the places where the playoff committee ended up ranking teams, even if I had that team in a different spot, it falls into that category where, like, even though I would have had them ranked differently, I can totally and completely understand why they were ranked where they were, and I understand the argument. But let's just kind of go through the playoff rankings, and not all of them, but we'll hit some of the high points and low points. They had Tennessee at number 1. I've got no problem with that. Tennessee's got a pretty good resume. I think you can make the argument that they've got the best resume of any of the undefeated teams. They've got an impressive win at home against Alabama. And look, any win against Bama is impressive. So everybody likes to pick on Tennessee. Oh, you won by 3 at home, last second field goal. Bama had 17 penalties. All that's true. It's also true Tennessee won the game, beat Bama at home. That's an impressive win. Kentucky, even though Kentucky's not currently ranked in the playoff committee's top 25, it's hard to forget what you saw most recently, right? And what we saw from Tennessee most recently was a complete destruction of Kentucky. Kentucky's had a pretty good defense this year. Tennessee goes up and down the field on them, scores 44 points. Ran all over them, threw all over them. Defensively, I think you can make the argument that was Tennessee's best defensive game of the year against Kentucky, holding them to 6 points. Will Levis under 100 yards passing. So now, as far as the Tennessee fans bragging about wins over Florida and Pitt, the playoff committee doesn't care about that, neither does Uncle Luke. Those are two terrible teams. Pitt's 4-4. They lost at home to Georgia Tech. Florida's a complete disaster under first-year head coach Sunbelt Billy, who doesn't know what he's doing. But here's the thing with your Tennessee. You don't even need to brag about those. The win against Alabama, the win on the road at LSU. You beat LSU by almost 40. What did you beat them, 40-13 or whatever the score ended up being? You absolutely humiliated LSU, who the playoff committee says is the 10th best team. Now, that's going to be one of the ones I disagree with, but the point is it's still an impressive win, even though I might not have LSU at 10, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Where would I have them? 15? It's still impressive. You beat the 15th best team, according to me, the 10th best team, according to the playoff committee, at their place by 30 points or whatever it was. So Tennessee's got a string of impressive wins this season. They do. They've got a string of impressive wins. So I can completely understand why the playoff committee would have Tennessee at 1, even though I Well, I agreed. Hell, I had Tennessee at 1 too. So me and the playoff committee agree there. Now, here's where we disagree a little, but I can get it, I guess. They've got Ohio State at 2 and Georgia at 3. I've got Georgia at 2 and Ohio State at 4. And the reason I've got UGA at 2 instead of Ohio State is, when I look at Ohio State, to me, Ohio State's best 2 wins, or best win is what? Penn State, right? They played Penn State this past week. Again, you're getting some recency bias here, I think. Ohio State played Penn State, beat them by 13 or 14 on the road at Penn State. That's an impressive win, okay? According to the playoff committee, Penn State is the 15th best team, according to the playoff committee. So according to the playoff committee, Ohio State beat the 15th best team by, I think it was 13 points. What was it, 44-31? 14 points, I guess. So you beat the 15th best team by 2 touchdowns, according to the playoff committee. That's your best win this year. Your other 2, your next 2 best wins, I think, are at home, week 1 against a bad Notre Dame team, 21-10, an 11-point win. Not really an impressive win looking back on it. You won. The game was never really in doubt, but even Ohio State fans, I think, would agree you'd like to beat a team like Notre Dame a little worse. And then after that, I think your most impressive win is against Toledo. You look at Georgia, on the other hand, according to the playoff committee, now not according to me, according to the playoff committee, Georgia beat the 8th best team in the country, Oregon, by 46 points. So Ohio State beats the 15 team by 14. Georgia beats the 8 team by 46. But somehow the playoff committee has Ohio State ahead of Georgia. I disagree with that. I just think Georgia should be ranked wherever you put Ohio State. I feel like Georgia should be ranked ahead of them. Georgia's got a better win, in my opinion, than Ohio State does. They're both undefeated. You're nitpicking here, but I would have, again, this isn't something where like I think they're totally wrong. You can obviously make an argument to have Ohio State at 2. The eye test, they look good. They really haven't struggled. They haven't come close to losing. There hasn't been an Ohio State game that I've watched where in the second half I thought they might lose. Whereas with Georgia, there was. There was a point early in the third quarter where I thought Georgia might lose that game to Missouri. Not a good win for Georgia. It was a bad win, 26-22. I don't know if that Georgia-Missouri game is what did it for the committee or not. I don't know. But that clearly was not an impressive win. But still, I would have Georgia. I would have Georgia at 2 and Ohio State at 4. I had Michigan at 3. They've got Michigan all the way down at 5. I completely and totally disagree with this. Michigan has one game where I guess you could say they struggled, and that was on the road at Maryland. And Maryland is not a good or great team, but they're also not a terrible team. Like Michigan beating Maryland by 7 at Maryland is way more impressive than Georgia beating Missouri by 4 at Missouri. It's way more impressive than Tennessee beating Florida by 5 at home. It's way more impressive than Ohio State beating Notre Dame by 11. And then you've got the head-to-head, you've got the common opponent matchup where Ohio State and Michigan have each played Penn State. Michigan absolutely destroyed them. I mean, just a beatdown. Ohio State won comfortably, but the game was competitive into the fourth quarter. Ohio State got a late pick 6 and pulled away at the end. Again, that doesn't make it a bad win for Ohio State, but in my opinion, if you're looking at best wins, Michigan's got a better win this year than Ohio State. I think Michigan's win over Penn State was more impressive than Ohio State's win over Penn State. What's holding Michigan back is their non-conference schedule. And this is something that I'm actually okay with the committee doing. But they need to be consistent in that, don't they? They appear to be punishing Michigan for their non-con schedule. Michigan played 3 non-con games. Not a single one of them was a Power 5 opponent. They were group of 5 opponents. Not only were they group of 5 opponents, they were 3 of the worst group of 5 teams on planet Earth. Hawaii, UConn, and I forget who the other one was, but just terrible, terrible teams. Okay, well, Georgia played Oregon. And they don't appear, to me anyway, to be being rewarded for that at all by the playoff committee. Georgia's the defending national champions. They're top 5 in every offensive and defensive category on planet Earth. They have destroyed almost every single team they've played, with that one exception being Mizzou. They're undefeated. They've got a 46-point win over the 8th ranked team, which was a non-con game that Georgia went out and scheduled. I don't understand why you would punish Michigan for their lack of a big non-con game, but then not reward a team like Georgia, who went out and scheduled a big non-con game, destroyed them, but it is what it is. So I disagree with the order that the playoff committee has Georgia, Ohio State, and Michigan, okay? They've got Ohio State 2, Georgia 3, Michigan 5. I've got Georgia 2, Michigan 3, Ohio State 4. They've got Clemson at 4. Clemson and TCU is an interesting case study to me. Clemson beats Syracuse at home by 6. They beat Wake Forest by a touchdown in overtime. What's their most impressive win? NC State? Well, it turns out NC State's not very good. Notre Dame goes on the road and destroys Syracuse a week after Clemson struggled to beat them at home by 6 in a game where Clemson had to make a quarterback change just to come back and win. Now, again, I'm not saying Clemson should be ranked way down at 9 or 10, but you compare that to what TCU's done. TCU's undefeated. They're the first team since 1960 to beat 4 ranked teams in a single month, which they did during the month of October. TCU has got some really good legitimate wins, including Kansas State, who the playoff committee tells us is the 13th best team, and Oklahoma State, who the playoff committee tells us is the 18th best team. So that's 2 higher wins than any win that Clemson has, because they've got the Syracuses and the Wake Forest of the world ranked down in the 20s. So it's just confusing to me how you could really make an argument to put Clemson ahead of TCU, but the playoff committee somehow figured out a way to do it. They've got Bama at 6 ahead of TCU. Again, this is something that just makes no sense to me. Now, I know the conspiracy theorists who are brain dead, Fruit Loop drooling retards think that the playoff committee is somehow in cahoots to just prop up Alabama. We hear this every year. I wish you could just realize for a few seconds how dumb you actually sound when you say that. Do you even know who's on the playoff committee? The playoff committee is made up mostly of current athletic directors. From the SEC? No. From Michigan, from Wyoming, from Colorado, from Virginia Union. There's exactly one playoff committee with a tie to the SEC. One playoff committee member with a tie to the SEC. I don't understand why it is people think that athletic directors on the West Coast, the Midwest, the Northeast, athletic directors from the Pac-12, Big 12, Big 10, ACC, I don't understand why the people think athletic directors from those other schools and other conferences are somehow secretly just trying to prop up Alabama. I think they just get it wrong sometimes. I think the playoff committee just gets it wrong. And I do think that there is big name bias, whether that's Alabama or anyone else. I think that is true. I think there is name recognition and big brand bias. And I think TCU is suffering from that right now when it comes to where they're ranked against Clemson and Bama. I really don't think there's any logical argument you can make to have TCU ranked below Clemson and Alabama. Alabama has lost to the only decent team they have played. Alabama doesn't have a single ranked win, not one. They lost to Tennessee on the road by 3. That's the only ranked opponent they've played. They almost lost on the road at Texas. So I don't want to hear anything from the committee about, well, yeah, TCU's undefeated, but they were trailing in the second half of like 3 of those games. Well, so was Bama. In fact, Bama was trailing in a game when it hit all zeros at the end and towed it an L, something TCU hasn't done. So it's just hard to understand how you would have, Bama, they should have lost that game to Texas. They had to survive a final snap against A&M from the 1-yard line to hang on and beat a terrible A&M team. It's hard to justify Alabama with a loss against the only good team they've played being ranked ahead of TCU, but yet here we are. Now, I don't really have a problem with 8 and 9. They've got Oregon and Southern Cal. I've got Oregon and UCLA at 8 and 9. UCLA and Southern Cal are going to play here in a couple of weeks, and that'll kind of work itself out. They each have the same record. I've got UCLA ranked ahead of Southern Cal because I think UCLA's loss right now is a better loss than Southern Cal's loss. But if you want to talk to me about eye test or where the teams fall in certain categories, stat-wise or something like that, and you want to try to make an argument for Southern Cal, I would be willing to listen to that. So this is one of those ones where I might disagree, but I can understand why you would have it that way. I just have them like 1 or 2 spots off. LSU at 10, I mean, LSU loses to a 500 Florida State team to start the year. The best team they've played this year, Tennessee, LSU lost at home by 30 or whatever it was, just an absolute beatdown. They're a 2-loss team. They're ranked ahead of a ton of 1-loss teams. It's hard to understand how you could legitimately have LSU at 10. And then even when you look at Ole Miss at 11, doesn't Ole Miss have 2 losses, or do they just, no, they just have the 1. Okay, their 1 loss is to LSU, which according to the committee is a top 10 team, but I disagree. And it wasn't a good loss. They lost by 15. So what are Ole Miss's best wins? Well, they beat an unranked Kentucky team by 3. They beat an unranked Auburn team by 14. Georgia beat that team by 30, 42-10, by 32. A&M, unranked, Ole Miss beat them by 3. They've got a bunch of close losses, or they got a bunch of close wins against unranked teams. They've got what I think is a bad loss to LSU. I don't think LSU should be in the top 10. The committee has them in the top 10, which makes that loss look better to the committee. But they've got Ole Miss at 11 ahead of UCLA at 12, who only has 1 loss, and it's to the number 8 team. Number 8, Oregon. Other than that, just 1 loss. Ole Miss lost by 15 to a lower-ranked team. Some of this stuff just makes no sense to me. Kansas State, they've got it 13. Kansas State would have been my first team out of the top 10. I would have had Kansas State at 11. Kansas State's a really good team. Of course, they just beat Oklahoma State 48-0. Their losses are to Tulane. Not a great loss, but it's a ranked loss. Tulane is ranked in the playoff committee poll. They only have 1 loss. Tulane does. And their only other loss was to TCU, who's undefeated. So Kansas State has lost 2 games, but those 2 teams that beat Kansas State have a combined total of 1 loss, and that's a Tulane loss, right? TCU, the committee tells you, is the 7th best team. Kansas State lost to them. Yeah, that's true. Kansas State was up by 3 scores in the second half of that game when not only their starting quarterback got injured and went down, their backup quarterback got injured and had to leave the game. Their 3rd-string quarterback had to come in. He could do nothing. And congrats to TCU. They didn't give up. They came back and won the game. But the playoff committee pretends to take injuries into account. K-State at 13, below LSU and Ole Miss? I don't know about that. I don't know. They've got Utah at 14, Penn State at 15. Illinois and North Carolina, they've got at 16 and 17. Those are each 1-loss teams. And these are 2 teams where rankings now matter, don't they? It's going to be almost impossible for Illinois or North Carolina, either one, to make the playoffs, even if they win out. And if they win out, in the case of Illinois, that means not only will they finish out their regular season at 11-1, but to win out, they'd have to then beat either Ohio State or Michigan, probably an undefeated Ohio State and Michigan, in the Big Ten title game. They'd be sitting there at 12-1 with a Big Ten title and would likely not get in at 12-1 because they're starting so far back. Same thing with North Carolina. What if Clemson runs the table? They're 12-0. They play an 11-1 North Carolina in the ACC title game. North Carolina could beat Clemson, and all that's likely to do is eliminate the ACC altogether. So rankings do matter for certain teams to an extent. I'm not going to go through the rest of the rankings. That pretty much sums it up there. But, it is exciting to talk about the rankings. Let's be real. One of the things that separates college football from almost any other sport on planet Earth is the subjective nature of how we rank and place teams in the postseason, right? And I know people get aggravated about it every year, but we love college football because it's not the NFL or some other type of sport, right? One of the things that separates college football, one of the things that makes college football is polling, rankings, power ratings, playoff polls, AP polls, coaches polls. And even though we all like to complain, we all like to bitch and moan, we all like to invent conspiracy theories about where certain teams are ranked where they are, I think we can all agree we love college football. And if you really sit down and think about it, part of the reason we love it is because of the subjective nature, right? I think that's why college football lends itself so well to arguments, right? Trash talking. Trash talking exists in every sport. Nothing comes close to college football, though, when it comes to trash talking, right? Because you're never really proven wrong unless you play a team head to head. You hear the, Ohio State and Georgia fans love to go back and forth all the time about who's the better team. Well, we rarely ever play. We haven't played since 1992. So I can't really prove Ohio State fans wrong. They can't really prove me wrong. But nevertheless, we argue about it year after year after year after year, right? It's that kind of thing that separates college football. So don't get yourself too worked up about these playoff rankings. Keep in mind that in most years since we've had the playoffs, which goes back to 2014, by the time the final playoff rankings have come out on that Sunday afternoon after a conference championship weekend, almost every year this thing has worked itself out. It looks like a mess right now. It almost always looks like a mess when the first ranking comes out. Usually by the time the final rankings are released, almost everybody on planet Earth agrees on at least 3 of the 4 teams. There have been a couple of years where legitimate arguments could be made over who should be the 4th team. But generally speaking, most of these things end up working themselves out. So don't get yourself twisted up in a knot with these first playoff rankings. Anyway, have a good morning.